I speak to you today with feelings of profound sorrow." The words were simple, but inside that private Windsor gathering, they carried a meaning that could change the monarchy in a single moment. King Charles had entered the room not simply as sovereign, but as a father, a husband, and the guardian of an institution older than anyone sitting around the table. Then came the sentence nobody expected to hear so soon. The crown must pass now. William did not answer. Camilla froze, and for several seconds nobody moved. In that silence, an entire royal era seemed to reach its breaking point. Before we go deeper into what this decision meant for the royal family, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next update. Because what happened inside that room was only the beginning. Charles knew there was no gentle way to explain what came next. He told those gathered at Windsor that he intended to step away from active sovereign responsibility and begin transferring the central burden of the crown to William immediately. And that distinction mattered. The crown, in this context, did not simply mean the object placed upon a monarch's head during a ceremony. It meant the authority, responsibility, and daily duties carried by the reigning sovereign. This was not a temporary reduction in workload. It was a deliberate surrender of responsibility. And everyone in that room understood the difference. William watched his father finish speaking. Then he slowly placed his pen beside the papers prepared in front of him. He had spent his entire life preparing for succession, the process through which the throne passes from one monarch to the next. But preparation had never included this. Charles did not look relieved. He looked exhausted. And for William, that small detail said more than any official declaration could have said. His father was not simply walking away from duty. He was admitting that continuing to carry it might eventually damage the very people and institution he was trying to protect. Camilla remained completely still. Then finally, she asked the question that everyone was thinking. Was Charles absolutely certain? There was pain in her voice, but there was no challenge. Charles looked directly at her. He told her that postponing what he now believed was unavoidable would hurt both the family and the monarchy. Camilla listened. She understood the certainty in his voice. But certainty did not make the answer easier. For her, this was not simply about titles. It was about a life beside her husband that had suddenly begun to change. William felt the room tighten again when Charles acknowledged that private conversations about an accelerated transition had already taken place. The prince realized something unsettling. His father had been preparing for this long before the family ever entered that room. Anne noticed it too. The Princess Royal had read enough official papers to recognize careful language. And the transition document lying in front of Charles appeared to suggest that the timing had been moved forward abruptly. Anne looked at the papers, then at her brother. William followed her expression. Something had happened. Something specific. And finally, the future king broke the silence. What happened that made today different? Charles had announced the end of one chapter. But before William could fully understand the crown waiting for him, he would have to understand who stood to lose the most. From the outside, succession can appear cold. Names, titles, ceremonies, ancient rules. Inside a family, however, it becomes something completely different. For Charles, stepping aside meant surrendering the duty he had waited most of his life to fulfill. For William, accepting meant inheriting a burden he had spent decades preparing to carry. And for Camilla, the announcement threatened something quieter, but just as personal. The life beside the king that she believed still had time left. Charles understood the contradiction immediately. Part of him believed he was making the responsible decision. Yet another part of him was grieving what that decision would cost. Succession had always been treated as inevitable. But inevitability did not make it painless. For Charles, this was not simply a transfer of duties. It meant watching his son step into a pressure that had shaped his own life for decades. William carried a different fear. He understood the constitutional path ahead. But understanding the rules did not silence the thought troubling him most. During a private corridor conversation, he turned to Catherine. He asked whether accepting the transition would make it appear that he had been waiting for his father's reign to end. Catherine answered carefully. Supporting Charles, she reminded him, did not mean replacing him as a father. William heard the reassurance. But the same question kept returning. Camilla later faced Charles without advisors, papers, or officials between them. She asked whether anything, she said, could change his mind. Charles did not answer immediately. Then he told her that some decisions become more painful when they are delayed simply because everyone is afraid of the hurt they will cause. Camilla understood, but understanding brought no comfort. Their life had already survived years of scrutiny. Now the future they believed they had was suddenly shrinking. Anne watched the family fracture quietly around the same sentence. She knew her brother well enough to recognize that this was not an impulsive decision. Charles had not reached this conclusion in a single morning. And Anne could see that William was beginning to understand the same thing. Catherine noticed the prince repeating one phrase under his breath. "Must pass now." She immediately understood the difference. Charles had not said the crown should pass soon. He had said it must pass now. There was necessity hidden inside those words. And William could no longer ignore it. Anne finally stepped toward her nephew. She told him there had been one private incident 3 days earlier, an incident that had changed Charles completely. And William deserved to know exactly what happened. The announcement had exposed the family's fear. But the real cause had begun before anyone entered that Windsor room. And Anne was about to take William back to the moment his father decided there could be no turning back. 3 days before the announcement, there had been no dramatic ceremony, no confrontation, no grand declaration. There had been only Charles, William, a closed study door, and a conversation that was expected to last 20 minutes. It lasted barely 3. William walked away, believing his father was simply exhausted. Charles remained behind in silence. What William did not understand was that those 3 minutes became the precise point of no return. Charles had already begun giving away pieces of responsibility before anyone had officially called it a transition. The king still represented continuity, the public appearance that the monarchy remained stable and functioning normally. But William was increasingly handling demanding engagements and sensitive family decisions in his place. And that imbalance mattered. Responsibility was moving faster than authority. William could carry the pressure, but he could not always make the final decision. Charles knew the arrangement was becoming harder to defend. William had raised the problem carefully during their private meeting at Windsor. He told his father that uncertainty could eventually become more dangerous than change if duties continued shifting without clear authority. Charles listened. Then, halfway through a discussion about the next 6 months, he stopped speaking. The silence stretched. He stared at the briefing folder lying open in front of him. And then he said, "You are already carrying what I am pretending is still mine." William reacted immediately. He tried to reassure his father. No one expected perfection, he said. There was still time to adjust gradually. Charles rejected the comfort. Not angrily, but firmly. He told William that kindness could not be allowed to disguise reality. He had spent too long believing endurance alone could protect stability. Now he feared hesitation was creating the very uncertainty he had wanted to prevent. Then Charles ended the meeting. William left. The king remained alone. The briefing folder stayed open on the desk, while Charles stared at the same page for several minutes. Later, Anne found him. She immediately understood that something had changed. She did not press him, but she saw enough to know her brother had already made an internal decision. That evening, Charles summoned two senior constitutional advisors. He asked them to present possible transition options. One plan would preserve his symbolic position while transferring major functions to William. Another would create a cleaner and faster handover. Charles rejected the slower option the following morning. His reasoning was simple. Divided authority would leave William carrying responsibility without having the clarity to use it properly. There was only one problem. Camilla still did not know how final the decision had become. Charles had crossed the point of no return alone. Now he would have to face the woman beside him and explain why the future they had expected had suddenly become shorter. Camilla had accepted years of scrutiny to stand beside Charles, but nothing prepared her for discovering that one of the greatest decisions of his reign had nearly been completed before she fully understood what was happening. When the door closed and the advisors disappeared, ceremony disappeared with them. She was no longer speaking to the king. She was speaking to her husband, and her first words were not diplomatic. "You decided all of this without me." Charles absorbed the accusation. He did not immediately defend himself. He knew this transition meant far more to Camilla than an institutional change. It threatened the life they had built together. He told her that he had delayed the conversation because he knew she would hear not only a constitutional decision, but the premature ending of a chapter they both believed still had time. Camilla understood William's position in the line of succession. She did not challenge his right to follow Charles. Her anger came from somewhere much more personal. She stood and asked whether her husband truly intended to surrender the role he had waited most of his life to inherit. Charles answered quietly. "Waiting a lifetime for something," he said, "did not give anyone the right to hold it for one day longer than duty allowed." Camilla pushed harder. She told him he had spent years carrying other people's needs. Now he appeared ready to protect William by sacrificing himself. Charles did not flinch. He told her that a father could not always protect his son by shielding him from responsibility. Sometimes protecting a son meant trusting him with everything. Camilla then asked the question beneath her anger. Had William pressured him? Charles rejected the suggestion immediately. In the private account of their earlier Windsor conversation, he made clear that William had actually urged caution and argued against rushing the decision. The decisive recommendation, Charles said, had come from him. He had studied what prolonged uncertainty could do to the monarchy. Camilla fell silent, because that answer removed every target. She could not blame William. She could not blame the advisors. She could not blame some palace faction acting behind Charles's back. The choice belonged entirely to her husband, and that made it harder to fight. Finally, Camilla asked the question Charles had been avoiding. If William took the crown, what would happen to her place, her responsibilities, and the life she had built beside him? Their confrontation ended without anger winning. But that question exposed the next battlefield, because transferring a crown also meant transferring power. Households, access, decision-making, authority. The monarchy could survive emotion. It had survived emotion for centuries. What it could not survive was confusion over who held authority. Once Charles made his intention irreversible, private grief gave way to hard questions. Who would approve decisions? Which household would take precedence? When would William's authority become complete? Yet beneath all those constitutional calculations sat one painfully human truth. Charles was watching officials prepare a world in which they would no longer turn first to him. Charles entered the next briefing, knowing the machinery had already started moving. Senior royal and constitutional officials began preparing to transfer decision-making, household authority, ceremonial responsibilities, daily briefings, and access protocols toward William. These details mattered, because power inside a monarchy does not change through speeches alone. It changes when documents move, when people move, when decisions move, when everyone begins turning toward someone else. William resisted any attempt to make the transition feel ruthless. He told officials that respecting the future could not mean treating his father like yesterday's monarch before the transition was complete. Charles heard those words. He said nothing, but the restraint carried emotion. His son was trying to protect his dignity, even while being prepared to replace him. Then came one small moment that revealed how quickly everything had changed. An official placed a red briefing folder on the table. Almost without thinking, he slid it toward William. Then he noticed Charles. He froze. The red folder contained confidential daily government material, information requiring royal attention. Charles looked at it. He paused. Then he touched the edge of the folder and deliberately pushed it the rest of the way toward his son. William stared at it. He did not open it immediately. The gesture felt heavier than any formal declaration. Charles finally broke the silence. "Do not make me ask twice." There was no anger in his voice, and somehow that made it more powerful. William understood. Accepting authority was no longer about ambition. It had become an act of obedience to his father's final decision. And later learned that Charles had asked for his remaining role to be sharply defined. The Princess Royal understood why. He wanted no rival center of authority, no competing court, no confusion about whether officials should continue seeking his approval. And once William began taking control, Catherine saw the cost from another direction. William would inherit decisions Charles had previously absorbed before they ever reached his desk. The future king would gain power, but he would also lose protection. Then the consequences began appearing. Invitations changed. Briefings changed. Household instructions began carrying William's authority. The crown had not yet completely changed hands, but the palace was already behaving differently, and the people closest to Charles could feel the new reality in almost every room. The most painful changes were never formally announced. They appeared in tiny details. A briefing delivered to William first. A schedule rearranged without Charles being consulted. An aide pausing outside the wrong door before remembering where authority now rested. For decades, everyone around the king had been trained to move toward him. Suddenly, the movement had changed direction. And although Charles had demanded exactly that, watching it happen was far harder than deciding it should happen. Charles entered the morning room, expecting the usual briefing. Immediately, he sensed something was different. The principal documents had already been taken to William. His son's expanded briefings now included decisions that had once been reserved for Charles alone. The embarrassed aide began apologizing. Charles stopped him. "Everything has happened exactly as I instructed." He meant it. Yet the pause before those words revealed how deeply the change had affected him. William felt the pressure building just as quickly. He was receiving heavier papers, longer schedules, more difficult questions, and questions that could no longer simply be returned to Charles for the final answer. Catherine began preparing for a larger role beside him. She understood that increased authority would bring increased scrutiny into their family life. Anne worked between both sides, making sure her brother was treated with dignity while refusing to create uncertainty about where responsibility was moving. She understood something important. Kindness without clarity could damage everyone. Later that day, Camilla found Charles alone. She asked whether he regretted the decision. Charles shook his head, but his answer carried pain. Choosing to give something away, he explained, was easier than watching the world learn to live without asking for it back. Camilla stayed beside him. She understood that Charles had surrendered control willingly. But the husband beside her was still grieving its disappearance. William responded differently. He changed one of his first planned meetings. He insisted that Charles attend, not as the man making the final decision, but as his father and predecessor. Catherine challenged him privately. She warned that turning every new responsibility into a tribute could eventually weaken the very transition Charles had chosen. If Charles had truly passed authority forward, then honoring him meant learning when to make decisions without him. William accepted the warning. But before the next public step, he made one request. He wanted Charles alone. No advisors, no papers, no ceremony, and no crown between them. The machinery of monarchy had begun separating king from kingdom. Now father and son needed to discover what remained when the titles were stripped away. For once, there were no advisors waiting outside. No documents, no ceremonial language. Charles and William sat alone, facing a truth neither had been able to say plainly in front of anyone else. One man was surrendering the role that had defined his destiny. The other was inheriting it before he felt ready. Yet the conversation was not really about power. It was about whether a son could move forward without making his father feel abandoned. William spoke first. Silence had become harder than honesty. He told Charles that he understood the constitutional reasoning behind the transition. He understood the rules. He understood the principles. He understood why divided authority could create uncertainty. But understanding did not remove his fear. Once every room began treating him as sovereign, he worried that something between them would change permanently. Charles listened without interruption. Then he told his son something he wanted him to remember. Titles could change how the world behaved around them. But neither man had to allow those titles to decide what remained underneath. William then admitted what he had avoided saying from the beginning. He was frightened, not by ceremonies, not by crowds, not even by public expectations. He was frightened by the possibility of making a decision his father would have handled better. Charles recognized something familiar in that confession. He told William that becoming king did not mean becoming infallible. A sovereign could still hesitate. A sovereign could misjudge. A sovereign could regret. The responsibility was not to avoid every mistake. It was to face each one without hiding behind the crown. Then William asked the question that mattered most. Do you regret announcing that the crown must pass now? Charles remained silent for several seconds. Then he answered. He regretted that the moment had become necessary. But he did not regret trusting his son. Charles explained that he had personally rejected a prolonged halfway arrangement. A divided authorate. Why, he believed, would force William to lead while constantly wondering whether his father might overrule him. Then Charles delivered the hardest lesson of the entire conversation. Never confuse protecting the institution with protecting the comfort of the people inside it. The monarchy could survive painful decisions. What it could not survive was leadership that delayed necessary decisions simply because those decisions hurt someone close. William understood. He no longer argued against the transition. He simply told his father that he would carry what had been entrusted to him, without pretending the burden felt easy. Charles accepted that answer, because he had never needed his son to feel fearless. He needed him to be honest enough to carry fear and responsibility at the same time. Finally, the door opened. Charles walked out beside William. Not ahead of him, beside him. Father and son had reached their understanding in private. Now millions of people would interpret the same moment in public, and everyone would see something different in the passing of an era. Outside the palace walls, private grief became public history. The announcement spread across broadcasts, phones, front pages, and crowded streets within minutes. Some people saw sacrifice. Others saw inevitable succession arriving ahead of schedule. But across every interpretation ran the same feeling. Something familiar had shifted. Charles was still present. William was still his son. Yet Britain was suddenly looking at both men differently. And neither could completely reverse that change. William watched the first wave of coverage with Catherine beside him. The language unsettled him almost immediately. Broadcasters described the prince as the new center of royal life. Palace communications emphasized continuity, the deliberate effort to show that the monarchy remained stable even as authority changed hands. Catherine heard the tension in William's breathing before he spoke. She switched off the television. She reminded him that public language would always move faster than private emotion. He could become the focus of the institution in a single day. Becoming comfortable with what that meant would take much longer. Charles faced the opposite pain. He heard crowds beyond the palace gates calling William's name. And pride arrived beside something he did not want to call grief. Camilla remained close enough to recognize the change in him. When no one else was nearby, she reached for his hand. She did not speak. She did not need to. Charles had chosen the transfer himself. But hearing the country emotionally turn toward his son made the sacrifice real in a way no document could. Buckingham Palace became the center of that public emotion. Evening crowds gathered near the railings. Newspapers appeared carrying the stark fictional headline, "The Crown Passes." One front page showed Charles and William leaving their private meeting side by side. The image carried enormous weight. Neither man looked triumphant. The father appeared to be releasing something. The son appeared to understand its cost. Then one broadcaster changed the tone of the national conversation with a single description. He called it a king choosing the moment of departure, rather than allowing circumstance to choose it for him. The phrase spread quickly, because it transformed the story from defeat into sacrifice. Charles was no longer being discussed only as a monarch stepping away. He was being seen as a father who had decided that protecting stability required surrendering control. William heard that framing later. He remained silent. Catherine watched him absorb it. She knew the next words would belong to him alone. By nightfall, Britain had interpreted Charles's sacrifice. But only one question remained. What did the transfer truly mean? When William finally stood where his father had once stood, the most important image was not a crown, not a signature, not a palace balcony. It was a father recognizing that duty had changed shape. Charles had spent most of his life waiting for the throne, and far less time occupying it than history had once seemed to promise. Yet in this dramatized story, his defining act was not holding power. It was releasing it, deliberately, painfully, and with enough certainty to tell his son, "Now it is yours." William accepted the responsibility without pretending he could become a copy of his father. He understood that continuity did not mean freezing the monarchy in place. It meant preserving its stability and duties while allowing leadership to change with a new sovereign. He honored Charles, but he also accepted that his own judgment would now have to stand on its own. That mattered, because loyalty could not become imitation, and respect could not become hesitation. Charles moved into a quieter role with defined responsibilities. He remained part of family life without creating a competing center of authority. The king had spent decades moving Toa, RD the center of royal duty. Now he was choosing the discipline of stepping away. Before William's first major appearance, Charles reached over and instinctively adjusted his son's cuff. Neither man spoke. For several seconds, there was only silence. And in that tiny gesture, the monarchy became a family again. Camilla felt some of the bitterness soften. She had fought the timing. She had questioned the secrecy. She had feared what the change would take from them. But now she chose loyalty over resentment. She remained beside Charles as he entered the quieter chapter he had accepted. Their years together were not erased simply because their public roles had changed. Anne understood her brother's decision with clarity. Charles had not stepped aside because the monarchy meant less to him. He had stepped aside because preserving it mattered more than preserving his own place at its center. That was the sacrifice beneath everything. William carried the final lesson with him. Inheriting the crown did not mean defeating the generation before him. His father's surrender of authority had become one final lesson in kingship. Power had value only when someone knew when to use it, when to share it, and when to release it. And so Charles's words, "The crown must pass now," became more than an announcement. They became his final statement about duty. Power was never truly his to possess forever. It was something he carried until the moment came to place it willingly into his son's hands. And perhaps that was the real meaning of the transition. A king does not prove his strength only by holding power. Sometimes the greatest test of strength is knowing when to let it go. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one.